The Second World War presented a terrible, undeniable truth. The United States and the Soviet Union found themselves on the same side. They faced a common enemy, Adolf Hitler's Germany. This alliance was born not of friendship, but of necessity. Yet beneath the surface, a deep mistrust simmered. American leaders like President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood the need to support the Soviet war effort. The Eastern Front consumed the majority of German military strength. Millions of Soviet soldiers were dying, buying time for the Western Allies, but questions lingered. What were Stalin's ultimate aims? The American public, too, harbored deep reservations. Communism stood in stark opposition to American ideals. The Soviet Union was the embodiment of this threat. Now suddenly this enemy was an ally. The alliance was a pragmatic choice, not a heartfelt embrace. Every strategic decision was viewed through a lens of suspicion. The Americans worried about Soviet expansionism. This alliance forged in war was always destined to be temporary. At the heart of the mistrust lay a fundamental difference in worldview. The United States championed capitalism and individual freedom. This was more than just an economic system. It was part of the American identity. The Soviet Union, in contrast, was founded on communist ideology. It called for the abolition of private property and a classless society. This system often meant authoritarian rule and a centrally planned economy. These were not merely different economic models. They were competing visions for the future of humanity. American democracy stood in direct opposition to the Soviet one-party state. This ideological chasm created mutual suspicion and fear. Each side viewed the other as an existential threat. American leaders feared the spread of communism. Soviet leaders feared capitalist encirclement. Few events solidified American distrust of the Soviet Union more than the Nazi-Soviet Pact of August 1939. Two ideological arch-enemies, fascism and communism, publicly declared their non-aggression. Stalin had positioned the Soviet Union as the leading anti-fascist power. Now suddenly Stalin was shaking hands with Hitler's foreign minister. The pact was not merely a promise not to attack each other. Secret protocols carved up Eastern Europe between Germany and the Soviet Union. Poland was to be partitioned. This was power politics at its most cynical. For the United States, this pact was deeply disturbing. The agreement enabled Hitler's invasion of Poland. 17 days later, Soviet forces invaded Poland from the east. The brutal efficiency with which Poland was dismembered horrified observers. This act of cynical self-interest cast a long shadow. Once the Soviet Union was thrust into the war, the pressure on its Western allies became immense. The Eastern Front was a scene of unimaginable carnage. Stalin issued desperate pleas for the opening of a second front in Western Europe. The Western allies had their own strategic calculations. Launching a cross-channel invasion was an enormous undertaking. Instead, Allied strategy initially focused on North Africa and Italy. This delay became a major source of tension. Stalin accused Roosevelt and Churchill of bad faith. When the D-Day landings finally occurred in June 1944, it was long overdue. The delay reinforced Soviet suspicions of Western motives. As the tide of war turned against Nazi Germany, the Red Army began its march westward. For the peoples of Eastern Europe, the arrival of the Red Army brought liberation from Nazi tyranny. But this liberation often came at a heavy price. The advancing Soviet forces were also an occupying power. Stalin was determined to create a buffer zone of friendly, communist-dominated states. Slowly but surely, the process of Sovietization began. Communist parties backed by the Red Army maneuvered their way into power. Non-communist leaders were marginalized or worse. What Roosevelt had hoped would be a sphere of influence based on cooperation was becoming Soviet control. This was not the post-war order the Americans had envisioned. Churchill described an iron curtain descending across the continent. For the United States, this was a betrayal of wartime agreements. Mistrust was hardening into outright hostility. The Second World War was also a war of intelligence, of spies and secrets. Both sides engaged in extensive espionage operations against each other. The Soviets targeted the Manhattan Project, America's race to build the atomic bomb. The development of the atomic bomb was shrouded in utmost secrecy. Stalin was well aware of the project thanks to a network of spies. Figures like Klaus Fuchs provided crucial information to Moscow. The discovery of Soviet espionage caused outrage and deepened American distrust. The case of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg became a symbol of this betrayal. The atomic bomb itself became a massive point of contention. When the United States used the weapon against Japan, it was also a message to the Soviet Union. Stalin ordered his scientists to accelerate their efforts. The nuclear arms race had begun. The transition from wartime alliance to Cold War enmity was a gradual unraveling. The conferences at Yalta and Potsdam were supposed to lay the groundwork for a stable post-war world. Agreements were made on the division of Germany and the establishment of the United Nations, but deep divisions were already apparent. Stalin's actions in Eastern Europe made it clear that his interpretation of democracy differed vastly from that of his Western counterparts. The post-war landscape began to solidify into two opposing blocs. In March 1946, Winston Churchill delivered a famous speech in Fulton, Missouri. He declared that an iron curtain had descended across the continent. The Soviet Union reacted angrily to Churchill's speech, but the reality of Soviet actions in Eastern Europe could not be denied. The wartime alliance was fracturing under the pressures of post-war realities. The stage was being set for a new kind of global conflict. As the late 1940s unfolded, a series of crises cemented the division of Europe. The city of Berlin became a critical flashpoint. In June 1948, the Soviet Union blockaded all access to West Berlin. The American response was the Berlin airlift. For nearly a year, American and British planes delivered essential supplies to West Berlin. The airlift demonstrated Western resolve. In May 1949, Stalin lifted the blockade. In response to the growing Soviet threat, NATO was formed in April 1949. It was a military alliance based on collective defense. Meanwhile, the United States launched the Marshall Plan. It offered aid to help European nations rebuild. The plan was a resounding success in Western Europe. The journey from wartime allies to Cold War adversaries was driven by a confluence of factors. The deep-seated ideological antagonism between American capitalism and Soviet communism formed the bedrock of mistrust. The actions and perceived intentions of both sides exacerbated these tensions. The Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939 remained a scar on American memory. The delay in opening a second front fueled Soviet suspicions. The dawn of the nuclear age added a terrifying new dimension to the rivalry. The American decision to keep the atomic bomb secret from the Soviets shattered any remaining illusions of partnership. The Grand Alliance that defeated fascism dissolved with alarming speed. Key events marked the milestones on this road to confrontation. The wartime allies now stood face to face, locked in a global standoff. The hopes for a lasting peace gave way to the grim realities of a new global conflict. The legacy of that wartime mistrust would shape the world for the next half-century.